There's a video making the rounds which purports to tell the real story of the Second Amendment, not the one told by the white terror gangs. It's called the Second Amendment Remedy, and it's an engaging and well-presented story, but ultimately it bears little relation to reality, and it's chock full of misinformation and outright falsehoods presented as fact. I've picked out 6 or 7 of the worst falsehoods, and I'm going to use some original sources as well as some reliable modern sources to show you that they are absolutely untrue. And I hope that after you watch this video, you understand that just because something looks slick, that doesn't mean you can trust it. Each one of these claims is pulled from the last 5 minutes of the video, and the video itself is over 15 minutes long. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm just frankly not going to get to. But starting with the first claim. After a quote from George Washington from 1794, we're told that the government's right to regulate weapons on an individual basis was never controversial. If this is true, then around the turn of the 19th century, we should not see any courts overturning state laws relating to carrying guns, because if it's never controversial that governments could regulate guns, then we shouldn't see this. But we do, unfortunately. So in 1822, Kentucky, in a case called Bliss, said that the state's right to keep and bear arms in the state constitution invalidated a state law prohibiting the carrying of concealed weapons. The second claim is that throughout the 1700s, guns had to be registered and you couldn't carry them around town, certainly not loaded. On the contrary, many colonies had laws saying you had to be armed, and at least one of those specifically said you had to have ammunition with you. So the idea that you could never carry a gun with you back in the 1700s is absolutely false, and we can look to the laws of those colonies at the time to see that. Next up, we're told there's no such thing as concealed carry in southern states. That was banned, and courts repeatedly asserted their rights to regulate firearms as they saw fit. Okay, so notice the shift in the discussion here. We've gone from the Second Amendment never guaranteed a right for you to carry a gun to specifically in southern states, in a certain time period, you weren't allowed to carry concealed. Those are two very different claims, two very different arguments, but we sort of shift from one to the other without acknowledging it. And it is true that southern states had laws against concealed carry, but those same states, at least 5 states in this time period, threw out regulations against open carry or concealed carry in one instance, as we've already discussed, while 5 other states upheld restrictions on carry. So if I'm going to be honest with you, I need to present that some states said yes and some states said no to the idea of individuals carrying firearms and that right being guaranteed under either the state constitution or the federal Second Amendment. The fourth claim jumps us to the 1900s, and we're told that the NRA testified in support of the first federal law to crack down on machine guns. That sentence in and of itself is true, but the implication is that the NRA as a whole supported gun laws or gun control back in the day. It was this good organization that just wanted to help out, and it's turned into some evil organization. That is the segue to the next claim, which we'll get to. But you need the full picture here to understand. Basically, the NRA in the 1930s, along with other organizations, decided that machine guns weren't worth the fight. They had no interest in them, but they did go to Congress and they said, hey, this legislation you're proposing, if you ban pistols, we will mobilize millions of voters against you. And some of the things you're proposing will put 95% of gun dealers out of business, which will leave people in rural areas without the ability to acquire firearms for self-defense. So again, clearly the idea of individual ownership of firearms for self-defense is not something that's brand new. And it's quite misleading to say that the NRA in the 1930s supported gun restrictions without acknowledging that the NRA in the 1930s also opposed gun restrictions. You need the full picture if you're going to have a proper understanding of the issue. The next claim says that in the 70s, the NRA dumped millions of dollars into propaganda to overturn 2 centuries of legal consensus over the meaning of the Second Amendment. And my question is, as always, whenever I hear this, where was the consensus? The Supreme Court had heard issues relating to the Second Amendment 3 times in over 200 years. The first time was Cruikshank in the 1870s, and all the Supreme Court said there was the Second Amendment only applies to the federal government, and it doesn't apply to an individual that might infringe your Second Amendment rights. That's not how rights work. A couple decades later, we had Presser saying you couldn't have your own private militia. I have several friends who will be disappointed to hear that. And then third, we have Miller. And Miller is often stretched to say things it never said. Miller never says that the Second Amendment doesn't guarantee an individual right to own guns. Miller says that sawed-off shotguns are not the sort of weapon used by the militia, and therefore a sawed-off shotgun can't be moved in interstate commerce without Congress being able to regulate it. That's what Miller says. So the issue was not settled, at least not by the Supreme Court. The issue was certainly settled in the minds of a lot of jurists, distinguished jurists in some cases, legal scholars, professors, because they never really paid attention to it. But as we will see when we discuss the next claim, the idea of an individual right certainly is not something that was invented recently. So the next claim is a quote from Warren Burger, and you've probably heard this before. He said in 1991 that one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I've ever seen in my lifetime is that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to own guns. If this was true, then we would not see, prior to roughly the 1970s or sometime in the late 1900s, we would not see any reference to the idea of the Second Amendment protecting an individual's right to own guns. We wouldn't find it anywhere. But we've already discussed state Supreme Court cases where those state Supreme Courts over 150 years ago said that the Second Amendment or state-level analogs protected an individual right to own guns. Some of them went so far as to say that the state legislatures couldn't regulate guns at all. Again, the idea that this was a fraud perpetrated on the American people is an invention itself. In addition to those state Supreme Court cases, I think probably the best piece of evidence that this isn't new or some sort of fringe thinking is that one of the most influential jurists of the 19th century, Chief Justice Cooke of the Michigan Supreme Court, he wrote a very, very well thought of book in the 1800s about constitutional law, actually several. And he said in 1880 that it would be a mistake to think that the Second Amendment doesn't protect an individual right to own firearms. A couple decades after that, in the early 1900s, the Idaho Supreme Court said that the Second Amendment itself, not just the state's constitutional right to keep and bear arms, but the Second Amendment invalidated a state law relating to the carry of firearms, and that the Second Amendment protected an individual right to carry guns. The last claim I'll discuss, in this video at least, is that today there are fewer gun laws in Tombstone, Arizona than there were in the 1800s under Wyatt Earp. And I have two responses to this. First of all, there are actually way more gun laws because there's federal and state laws that apply even though Tombstone's ban on carrying guns no longer exists. And second, if Tombstone was better off when there was a ban on carrying guns, why are there no more gunfights in Tombstone, Arizona? At least, not real gunfights. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. We'll have more videos like this. I'm going to be discussing a Ninth Circuit case that came out last month, Young versus the State of Hawaii. And we'll also be talking about New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Corlett, which is going to the Supreme Court. Thanks for watching.